Welcome. I'm Joanna Hildreth with the Catoosa County Republican Party's Candidate Interview Committee. Thank you for taking the time out of your campaign to participate in this interview process. We have extended this invitation to all candidates in this race for the purpose of aiding the voters in making their decision. This video will appear on the Catoosa County Republican Party webpage. Every effort will be made to maintain this interview exclusively on that site. The interview will be shown in its entirety. For the interview, we will be asking around 15 questions, but we can offer no prompting. There are no right or wrong answers, only your answers. We ask each candidate the same questions. Please introduce yourself and state the position you're running for.
Jeremy Jones, and I'm running for State House District 3.
Thank you. We'll go ahead and get started with the questions. What does being a Republican mean to you?
Well, the Republican Party, as we know, is founded on individual liberty and accountability. To me, that's what it means. It stands for making your own way through life and doing what needs to be done, but still there are things that the government does need to do. We're not the same as libertarians who thinks whatever you get is what you get. The paraplegics, they need help from society, and that is a function of government. Some would call that a welfare state. I do not. I think that we do help those who cannot help themselves. Another function of government is to enforce private contracts between people. So that's what being a Republican is to me, is one for personal accountability and freedom to engage in commerce with your fellow man.
Do you believe that HB 757, the Religious Liberty Bill, serves to enhance or infringe on individual liberty and property rights? And do you support the governor's veto?
Whenever a bill comes to me to decide if I'm going to support it or not, the first thing that I'm going to ask is this something that is authorized by the Georgia Constitution and, if necessary, the United States Constitution? At the same time, another question we're going to ask, is this a bill that solves a problem? Is it something that's going on right now? The Religious Freedom Bill, the way I understand it, came about because people are afraid of the baker getting sued because he or she didn't want to bake a cake for somebody with whom they disagreed with for religious purposes. Things like that have not happened in Georgia. So I don't know what problem that particular bill solved. I also do agree that you need to be on the forefront of things that you anticipate that can become a problem. But going back to the question about being a Republican, we have the right to do business with whom we want. And if there's a bill that's going to protect me or somebody else from choosing not to do business with somebody, then that certainly sounds like a reasonable thing. However, one has to keep in mind that, pardon me, we can't just have bill after bill saying that we're going to protect this particular religion or we're going to protect that particular religion. If somebody doesn't want to bake a cake for me, then I can take my business elsewhere. And I think most Georgians are smart enough to do the same thing.
House Bill 751, the fiscal year 2017 budget, is set by a revenue estimate of $23.7 billion, an increase of $673.9 million, or 2.9% over the amended fiscal year 2016 budget. Would you vote for any future budget that was larger than the previous year's budget?
I will not commit myself to always vote yes for this thing or always vote no for that thing based on information that we have today. Things change. There can be a bill that has everything Republicans want. It can have tax cuts. It can have program reductions. It can have more freedom for people, but yet still have a small increase in the total size. I'm not going to throw away that budget where we get 75, 85, 90% of what Republicans want just because there's a small portion that there is some type of increase in the total budget. One thing that a lot of Republicans and a lot of people in Georgia say is they want to cut down on welfare. Well, since 2010, welfare expenditures in Georgia have decreased, and that's a good thing. That's getting more people off of welfare, off of me supporting them, and they are becoming productive citizens and contributing to the revenue of Georgia that benefits everybody. So the welfare's gone down. Some taxes have been cut. Unfortunately, some taxes have been raised. But I'm not going to pigeonhole myself to say that I'm going to vote no for a budget because there's a 2% increase over last year, if it's a budget that contains a lot of the other things that I want, that people of the 3rd District want, the people of Georgia want, and Republicans want. The budget's looked at as a whole. I'm not going to say I will not vote for this because of that. I'm going to look at it as a whole, see if it is the best budget we can get for Georgia at this time. And that's how I'll decide on whether or not I'm going to vote for something.
Would you support the repeal of Georgia's participation in Common Core?
I have on my website, votejeremyjones.com, my position on Common Core. And I know a lot of people are against it. I know some people are for it. But I don't see Common Core as different from any other educational program. Different children learn in different ways. And if elements of Common Core help certain children, I don't want to take that away from them. Nor do I want to force it on those who it doesn't benefit. I'll be honest, I've looked through the Common Core math, and that's how I learned math. So maybe I'm an anomaly and maybe I'm some goofy guy, I don't know. But that type of math instruction is what helped me. But I know it doesn't help everybody. So I am not in favor of taking away a tool that can be used, nor am I in favor of forcing a tool on somebody that it may not be beneficial for. I think the choice should lie with the local school board, and I think it should lie with especially teachers in the classroom. And every teacher should have every tool available to her or him to be able to decide what is best. So no, I'm not in favor of saying we can't use Common Core, nor am I in favor of saying we must always use Common Core. It is a tool that should be available to the local school board and to the teachers in the classroom.
Do you believe that the state of Georgia should have a state income tax or abolish it, such as neighboring states like Tennessee?
I got a questionnaire from a tax group, and I won't say their name mainly because I forget it off the top of my head, but they went through the different things, and one of the questions they asked, would you support a repeal in the income tax? And that sounds like a good thing. Then they asked, will you support a repeal in the sales tax? Then they asked, would I support a repeal in the property tax? Well, at some point, we don't have any taxes. And I don't think anybody thinks we have too little taxes right now. Of course, we probably have too much. But would I support a repeal in the income tax? Absolutely. I would support any repeal of any tax so long as we can still do the things that are required of our Constitution and required for the people of Georgia. I'm not going to turn into an anarchist where everybody has to fend for themselves. But if we can get our spending cut to where the levels that it needs to be, then there's a lot of room to cut taxes, whether it is to put a cap on property tax, eliminate property tax for certain segments, or get rid of the income tax, such as Florida and Tennessee have done. Both of those states have done it, and as far as I can tell, neither one of them have a bunch of starving children and elderly people dying in the streets. So obviously, several states have shown that we can live without an income tax. So I certainly would not be opposed to looking at that and seeing what can be done and fighting for it if possible.
Would you sponsor or support a constitutional carry bill that would allow any law-abiding citizen to conceal carry?
Yes.
Do you think it's ever justified to vote for unconstitutional legislation if the infractions are small, as long as there are benefits?
I don't think so. The way that question's worded, it lends itself to the answer of no, I would never support something no matter how small the infraction is. But let's be honest, bills come before us, we think they're a good idea, we think they're constitutional, we vote for them, and then a court somewhere decides that it's not constitutional. Hopefully I could be held to a little bit higher standards since I do have a law degree, so hopefully I would understand the bills better than some of the other people. But I would never knowingly support a bill that it infringes on the Georgia Constitution or when required the U.S. Constitution.
Will you support legislation to end the use of no-knock warrants?
No, I would not. I would support legislation that made it tougher to get a no-knock warrant. Right now, the way that the law is, you can have a no-knock warrant if there's ample evidence that the people inside are dangerous or that they can destroy evidence. I think the destroy evidence is where a lot of no-knock warrants are used and approved, and they shouldn't be. Yes, it's bad that evidence gets destroyed, but I don't think it's worth risking the lives of the people inside and the law enforcement going in. But there is a small need for no-knock warrants. The U.S. Supreme Court has identified what that small need is, and I agree with the Supreme Court when they say if they're going into a situation where they know they can be killed upon entry, then I think that if those people are that bad that we have to get them off the street, then those types of people need to be engaged with the no-knock warrant. I certainly would support limiting them and certainly put a stronger criteria for when it says, or the destruction of evidence.
Would you stand against House leadership or sponsor legislation that cut waste, enhanced individual liberty, or lowered taxes, even if you stood alone?
Yes.
Excuse me for a minute. I need to make sure that my phone is turned off. I'm afraid that that's burning again. Sorry, that was my mistake there. In a House, Senate, or governor's office that is controlled by Republicans, do you think our party's platform has been reflected in their accomplishments?
Well, as I mentioned earlier, the one thing that Republicans yell out from the top of the rooftops, if you will, cut welfare, cut welfare. Well, welfare, the spending, actual spending in welfare has decreased since 2010, and I think that's a good thing. I think that in any budget, especially in this a state the size of Georgia, with the diversity that we have in political parties and ideas, I think that Governor Deal and the Republican leadership have done a lot to accomplish the Republican platform. I know that there's more that they want to do, but as I said about everything, you can't expect to make a change on day one. You start fighting day one and you work your way through it, but as they say, you eat an elephant one bite at a time, and the state of Georgia has a $23.5 billion budget. You're not going to get it cut down to 16, 15, or pick whatever your number that you think it should be in one gubernatorial term. So it's the spending has gone up, but our revenues have gone up, but our tax rates have not really reflected the same amount that our revenue's gone up. So the Republican idea of cutting taxes and cutting out wasteful spending it has helped the state of Georgia. So if I had to give them a grade, I would say they probably have a B somewhere.
What are your thoughts on taking federal money to expand Medicaid, including the use of government waivers?
We have made a promise to the senior citizens, and that's where Social Security, Medicare go together. Your question was about Medicaid, I believe. Medicaid is the program that is for the poor, and and as far as taking federal money and expanding it, at first blush I'm against it. I was asked this question a couple days ago, and the person who brought it to my attention is a Republican, and he brought up some good points that I had not considered. I'm going to do more research on it. Right now, my position is no, I don't think it's a good idea. But as research comes in, if what he told me was correct, and that is that you can get that money and offset Georgia spending and also not hurting the Georgia taxpayers, then it's something to consider. But I've made my position known very clearly about taking federal money at all. I think that we get so hooked on federal dollars and they control what we can do. So my biggest concern about taking federal money to expand Medicaid is, what does it require the state of Georgia to do that we may not be in favor of? Again, the person who I was talking to said there aren't any hooks like that into it, and I don't know. Once I look in that, and if what he said is true, then it's something that I would consider, but as of right now, I'm not in favor of it.
Would you oppose any bill that impedes free speech, including any so-called ethics reform bill that would require a citizen organization to divulge its donor or member information?
Well, no, there's no bill that I would support that would impinge people's free speech. But here's where you get into a catch-22. People demand that there's more ethics reform. People demand that we know who the lobbyists are that are talking to the state representatives and the senators. And certainly that's a valid point to make. But as you just pointed out, if 4 people here locally wanted to go down and talk to me, your new state representative, or Senator Mullis, they could be considered a lobbyist group. And if Jim, Bob, Judy, and Sally were the ones who went down there, and Fred is the one who gave them $1,000 to pay for their hotel and pay for their gas, should they have to disclose that Fred paid for all that? Fred's just the farmer down the road that knew they had something good to say to the representatives. But you flip that around, and it's the same 4 people, and let's just say that Fred owns a GMO plant, and everybody thinks that GMO is bad, and they don't want these chemicals on their food. All of a sudden, now they want to know who's paying for these people to go down there and talk. So it's really in a catch-22, because I can answer the question and say, no, I don't think this should be disclosed. The opposing side's going to say, well, then how are we supposed to know the transparency of government? You have to know who's talking and who's paying for these things. So I think that there's a balancing act in there somewhere. I give people $25 to go down to Atlanta. I've donated to some small causes so that people can go and talk to their legislatures, but I don't consider myself a lobbyist. But if I would have given them $100 or $200 or whatever the limit is, then I'm classified as a lobbyist, even though I've done nothing different. So you're in a catch-22 there, and people demand ethics reforms, and that's one of those things that, as your representative, I'm going to have to go by what the will of the people are. I mean, it doesn't go against my principles. So if the majority of the people want to know who's funding the lobbyists to go down and talk to them, that's something I would have to vote for, but I would want to argue strongly against it, to say that there are exceptions to it, and a lot of them. I think most of the people, especially down there, the senators and the representatives, lobbyists do serve one important function. They do a lot of research. And people say, well, yeah, they do it for just their own side. Well, guess what? There's 2 lobbyists for every position. One for it and one against it. So you look at both of them, you look at the research, you decide what you think is best, you poll your people back in your district and decide and find out what they support. And I think this is the same thing. You just have to, it's a fine balancing act. But of course, nobody wants to support quelling free speech. It's the cornerstone of our representative republic.
Would you support legislation that would end policing for profit, require charges be filed before any assets are seized by law enforcement, and ensure that property is returned if charges are dropped or the suspect is acquitted?
That almost sounds like 2 different questions. The private police thing, I'm going to go off on one tangent about that. I am wholly against 100% the prisons for profit, the private prisons that the state pays. I've made it clear that I think if there's a function that the private sector can do better than better than our government, then it should certainly go over to the private sector. The private sector almost always does something better. But in the prison world, here's the problem with it. They save the state 2 to 3%, at best 8% on the studies that I've read. The problem is they have an incentive to lobby and get small, nonviolent drug offenses to be jail time. So people go to jail for things that we normally wouldn't put them in jail for. We also guarantee that they'll be at a certain capacity full, 70%, 80%, whatever the particular contract has. I'm completely against that. Jailing citizens is a serious thing, and it should only be done by the state. Now, as far as the civil asset forfeiture that you talked about, the question specifically said, would I support where only charges were filed and the stuff automatically go back? The second half of the question, absolutely yes. Once charges are either dropped or the person is acquitted, any assets that that were taken from them should be given back immediately without having to pay a lawyer to do it, which is the case almost every time right now. As far as getting the assets beforehand, we're in a sticky position. The U.S. Supreme Court has made a ruling on that, and it's not one that we like. So whether or not we can pass a law that says we can't take stuff until still charges are actually made, that's what I would support, but it has to be worded properly so that we don't, so the state can't argue that we have violated the Constitution. I think the U.S. Supreme Court has said, obviously as they do in everything, they said a minimum. I think that ours would, such a bill would pass constitutional muster, so I think it'll be fine.
Do you support or will you actively work to abolish what is commonly known as regionalism, an unelected council that presides over one of 12 regions that is appointed by the governor, lieutenant governor, or speaker of the House of Representatives?
Yes and no. They shouldn't have any type of taxing authority, or they shouldn't have any type of policy-making authority. To have regionalism where they report back to the governor, or they report back to the House or the Senate to say, hey, this region really needs this and that region really needs that, I think that's a good thing. I think that's something that benefits the representatives and the senators down there. As you know, representatives are based on population, so obviously when you're down in Atlanta, most of the representatives down there are directly affected by what happens in Atlanta, so their votes reflect that. But when you have a regionalism thing, they can see that this independent or semi-independent council has said North Georgia really needs this, whether it be our state roads are in disrepair, we need more red lights at twin-seaters or whatever, little things like that. That board can report back to the Senate and the House and give them their recommendations. So I do support it in that regards, but I do not support it that they have any type of taxing or policy-making authority.
Okay, we've reached the last question. Currently, it is legal to use cannabis oil for medicinal purposes in Georgia, but there isn't a way for it to be legally obtained. Would you support a bill legalizing cannabis cultivation in Georgia?
Sure. I think this question really gets back, no matter how I answer it, everybody's going to interpret it as, does he or does he not support the legalization of marijuana, whether it be for recreational use or for medicinal use? I have two different answers for each of those. For medicinal use, if doctors think it's the best thing for their patients, they shouldn't be hamstrung. They should be allowed to prescribe what they think is best for their patients. And so obviously we can't have a bill where we allow a particular medicine, but then we have no way of getting it. That's ludicrous. I don't know if it was an oversight. I don't know if it was done intentionally so they can say, hey, we passed it, but yeah, really, we're not going to use it. I don't know. If we're going to allow a particular product, whether it be cannabis oil or whatever, to be prescribed by doctors and to be used, obviously they have to have a way to get it here. Whether it's cultivating or importing it, it doesn't matter. It just needs to be done. As far as the legalization of marijuana, I've said from the beginning, my answer is decriminalization. And the difference between the two is legalization, it now gets the government in yet another aspect of your life. Under decriminalization, it gets them completely out of it. So I'm more for decriminalization of it. And if you want to grow some in your backyard and use it for yourself, that's fine. But obviously you'll get in trouble if you're out selling it on the streets. But decriminalization, because that would get rid of a lot of problems in our court systems and really free up judges and public defenders to do what they're supposed to be doing, and that's taking care of the criminals that are hurting other people.
Okay, well, this concludes the interview. Thank you very much for taking the time to participate in our interview process.
Thank you for having me.